October 23, 1935, 22:15. Palace Chop House, Newark, New Jersey. The smell of heavy starch, cheap cigars, and pot roast lingered in the humid air of the back room. Outside, a relentless autumn rain hammered against the brick walls of the tavern. Inside, Arthur Flegenheimer, better known to the world as Dutch Schultz, was hunched over a table, frantically scribbling numbers on a napkin. He was trying to calculate how much the government had bled him dry, unaware that the syndicate had already signed his death warrant. Suddenly, the side door kicked open. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a dull, heavy thud that cut through the clinking of glasses. Two men stepped in from the shadows of the hallway. Charlie, the bug workman, didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The cold, metallic click-clack of a .45 caliber slide racking back was the only introduction needed. Dutch didn't even look up before the first volley tore through the room. Lead shattered the plates, splintered the heavy oak table, and ripped into the bodies of his bodyguards. One man, Lulu Rosenkrantz, lunged for his holster, but a slug caught him mid-air, pinning him against the wallpaper. Dutch scrambled toward the bathroom, clutching his side, his face a mask of disbelief. He had survived the feds, the taxman, and the streets of the Bronx, only to be cornered in a Jersey hash house. To understand how the beer baron of the Bronx ended up bleeding out on a cold tile floor, we have to look at the man who wasn't in the room, the man who whispered the location, the man who traded a king's life for 8 years of borrowed time. The syndicate didn't just want Dutch dead, they wanted his empire dismantled. But in the underworld, every vacuum is filled by a ghost. And Dutch, even as his life ebbed away, whispered a name to the police that would haunt the streets of New York for nearly a decade. The error wasn't the hit. The error was assuming that everyone in the room was accounted for. The betrayal was complete, but the bill hadn't been settled yet. Somewhere in the rainy night, a shadow was moving toward the docks, carrying a secret that would change the American mafia forever. 4 years earlier, July 1931, 02 was the Embassy Club, Manhattan. The air was thick with the scent of illegal gin and expensive perfume. Dutch Schultz sat at a corner table, his eyes darting across the room like a hawk. Across from him sat Albert the Tailor Visa. Albert wasn't a shooter. He didn't have the broad shoulders of a leg breaker or the scarred knuckles of a street fighter. He had clean fingernails and a mind like a Swiss watch. "You're sure about the numbers, Albert?" Dutch asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The numbers don't lie, Arthur," Albert replied, sliding a ledger across the silk tablecloth. "Luciano is skimming. Not much, just enough to show he doesn't respect the borders. If you don't squeeze him now, he'll own the docks by Christmas." Albert was the man who kept the books, the man who knew which judges were on the payroll and which cops needed a bonus. He was the invisible bridge between Dutch's brutal violence and the cold logic of corporate crime. But Albert had a secret. He was tired of being the tailor for a man who constantly tore his own clothes. He saw Dutch's temper, the legendary Dutch spark, as a liability. In the criminal hierarchy of New York, loyalty was a currency that suffered from heavy inflation. Albert watched Dutch berate a waiter for a lukewarm steak, seeing the veins bulge in the mobster's neck. He realized then that being the right-hand man to a mad king was a death sentence. He began to build a fire escape, a secondary set of books, a hidden stash of cash, and a direct line to the very men Dutch wanted to destroy. He wasn't just planning a career change. He was planning an exit strategy that involved a heavy price in blood. The city hummed outside, a concrete jungle of neon and steel. Albert looked out the window, realizing that in this game, you don't win by being the strongest. You win by being the one who holds the map. But maps can be stolen, and the men who draw them often find themselves erased from history. Albert was playing a game of chess, where the pieces were made of lead. March 1934, 14, Federal Courtroom, New York City. The sun streamed through the high windows of the courtroom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Dutch Schultz sat at the defense table, looking uncharacteristically small in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, a tactic to make him look like a common man bullied by the government. Thomas Dewey, the relentless prosecutor, was dismantling Dutch's empire brick by brick. In the gallery, Albert Weser sat quietly. He felt the heat of the room, the sweat prickling at his collar. He knew that the feds had something they shouldn't have, the Green Ledger. It was the one book Albert had kept separate, the one that linked Dutch to every murder and every bribe from Harlem to the Battery. Someone talked, Dutch hissed to his lawyer, his eyes burning a hole through the back of Albert's head. Albert didn't flinch. He had already met with Dewey's assistants in a dimly lit basement in Brooklyn 2 nights prior. He didn't want to flip. He wanted protection. He gave them just enough to keep the pressure on Dutch, but not enough to put himself in the electric chair. It was a delicate dance on the edge of a razor blade. Back at the headquarters, the atmosphere was toxic. The Dutch spark had turned into a permanent wildfire. Schultz was convinced there was a rat, but he was looking at the low-level runners, the guys who handled the booze trucks. He couldn't conceive that his tailor, the man who knew his shoe size and his mother's birthday, would ever cross him. Trust is for people who can afford to lose, Albert whispered to himself that night, packing a small leather satchel with untraceable bills. The weight of the betrayal was starting to manifest. Albert noticed a black sedan following him from a distance. Was it the feds, or was it Dutch's specials? The paranoia of the hunted began to seep into his bones, turning every shadow into a gunman. The foundation wasn't just cracking, it was dissolving. And Albert knew that when the house fell, he needed to be miles away, under a different name, with a different face. October 22nd, 1935, 23:30. A nameless diner, Ironbound District, Newark. The night before the massacre, the air felt electric, charged with the ozone of an approaching storm. Albert met with Lucky Luciano's representative, a man known only as the Whisperer. They sat in a booth at the back, the smell of burnt coffee and grease hanging heavy between them. "Dutch is going to kill Dewey," Albert said, his voice trembling slightly. "He's lost his mind. He thinks he can hit a special prosecutor and walk away. If he does it, the heat will burn all of us to the ground." The Whisperer nodded slowly. The Commission, the Board of Directors for the National Crime Syndicate, had already debated this. Dutch was a loose cannon. A hit on Dewey would bring the full weight of the US government down on the mafia. They couldn't allow it. "Tell us where he'll be," the Whisperer said. Albert hesitated. This was the point of no return. Once the words left his lips, Dutch Schultz was a dead man walking. He thought about the years he spent building Dutch's fortune, the times they had shared a bottle of scotch, and laughed about outsmarting the world. The Palace Chop House, tomorrow night, 10 p.m. He's meeting his crew to finalize the Dewey hit. Albert slid a piece of paper across the table. It contained the floor plan of the tavern and the location of the back entrance. In exchange, Albert wanted a pass, safe passage out of the city, and a guarantee that the syndicate would never look for him. He walked out into the cold Newark night, the neon sign of the diner flickering behind him. He felt a strange lightness, as if he had shed a heavy coat. But deep down, he knew the legend effect of Dutch Schultz. Dutch wasn't a man who died easily. He was a force of nature. Albert had sold the location, but he hadn't sold his soul. Not yet. He had 8 years to figure out if the price was worth it. June 1939, a quiet suburb in Chicago. Albert Vesser was gone. In his place was Arthur Miller, a quiet, unassuming bookkeeper for a small construction firm. He lived in a modest house with a manicured lawn. He had a wife who didn't know his real name and a dog that barked at the mailman. For 4 years he had lived in the grey space between existence and memory. He followed the news from New York like a religious scholar. He read about the fall of the Schultz empire, the rise of the Commission, and the relentless pursuit of Murder, Inc. by the authorities. Every time a car slowed down in front of his house, his heart would hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. The silence was the hardest part. In the old life, the noise was constant. The sirens, the shouting, the gunfire. Here, the only sound was the wind in the trees and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was a silence that felt like a countdown. One afternoon, while reading the Chicago Tribune, he saw a small blurb about a body found in the Hudson River. It was one of Dutch's old associates. The syndicate was cleaning house. They were erasing everyone who remembered the old days, everyone who knew how the power had really shifted. Albert realized then that his pass had an expiration date, The commission didn't leave witnesses, and they certainly didn't leave men who knew where the bodies, and the money, were buried. He started sleeping with a .38 under his pillow. He stopped going to the movies. He became a ghost in his own life, a man waiting for a knock that he knew was coming. He had escaped the fire, but the smoke was finally catching up to him. He was about to learn that in the mafia, the only true retirement is 6 feet under. September 1941, New York City, the Lower East Side. The war was raging in Europe, and New York was a city of lights and shadows. The syndicate had matured. It was no longer a collection of street gangs, it was a shadow government. And they had a problem. A ghost was talking. A low-level informant, facing the chair at Sing Sing, mentioned a name, Albert Wedzer. He claimed Albert hadn't died in '35, as everyone assumed. He claimed Albert was living large on Dutch's hidden millions. It was a lie. Albert was barely scraping by, but in the mob, a rumor is as good as a confession. The commission sent out the word. They didn't use the usual hitters. They wanted someone who knew the old ways. They hired a cleaner named Sal the Mute Ruggiero. Sal was a relic of the Prohibition era, a man who treated murder like a craft. Sal began the hunt. He didn't go to Chicago. He went to the Bronx. He visited the old social clubs, the dusty back rooms where men played cards and remembered the Dutch spark. He followed the trail of the money, looking for the subtle ripples Albert had left in the financial pond. Meanwhile, back in his quiet life, Albert felt the net tightening. He received a postcard with no return address. It was a picture of the Palace Chop House, no message, just the image of the place where it all ended. "They found me," he whispered to the empty living room. He didn't run. Where could he go? He had spent 8 years running, and he was tired. He decided to make one last move, a gamble that would either buy his freedom or ensure his death. He contacted an old friend in the NYPD, a man who owed his career to Albert's tips. The game of chess was entering the endgame. Albert was the king, cornered and vulnerable, but he still had one pawn left to play. November 12, 1943, 03 AGS, Pier 54, Manhattan. The fog rolled off the Hudson like a heavy grey shroud, swallowing the shapes of the docked freighters. The air tasted of salt and diesel. Albert stood at the edge of the pier, his coat collar turned up against the biting wind. He was waiting for Sal Ruggiero. He hadn't called the cops for protection. He had called for a negotiation. He knew Sal wasn't just there to kill him. He was there to find Dutch's lost treasure, the legendary safe full of gold and bonds that Schultz had supposedly buried before his death. "You're a hard man to find, Albert," a voice rasped from the fog. Sal stepped into the dim light of a street lamp. He was holding a heavy suppressed pistol, the silhouette of it jagged and predatory. "The treasure doesn't exist, Sal," Albert said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "Dutch spent it all on lawyers and bribes. The legend is just a story we told to keep the guys in line." Sal laughed, a cold, dry sound. "The commission doesn't believe in stories, Albert. They believe in results. If the money isn't there, you're just a liability with a long memory." Albert reached into his pocket. Sal leveled the gun at his chest. Albert pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, the real green ledger. "This is worth more than gold, Sal. It's got the names of every judge, senator, and CEO the syndicate has bought since 1930. You kill me, it goes to the district attorney. You let me walk, and it's yours. Why be a button man when you can own the buttons?" The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of history. For a moment, the fate of the American mafia hung on a choice between greed and loyalty. November 12, 1943, 0305, Pier 54. Sal Ruggiero looked at the ledger, then back at Albert. He saw a man who was already dead, a man who had outlived his era. Sal wasn't an ambitious man. He didn't want to be a kingmaker. He wanted to survive. And in his world, you don't survive by holding on to evidence. "The commission doesn't like surprises, Albert," Sal said softly. Thwip. The sound of the suppressed shot was no louder than a dry branch breaking. Albert felt a sudden sharp coldness in his chest. He staggered back, his boots slipping on the wet wood of the pier. He looked down at the dark stain blooming on his white shirt. Thwip, thwip. 2 more rounds. Albert fell backward, his body hitting the freezing water of the Hudson with a dull splash. The ledger slipped from his fingers, fluttering for a second before sinking into the black depths. Sal stood at the edge of the pier for a long minute, watching the ripples dissipate. He didn't feel triumph. He felt a strange sense of finality. With Albert Weser gone, the last link to Dutch Schultz was severed. The beer baron was finally, truly dead. But Sal didn't realize that Albert hadn't come alone. In the shadows of a nearby warehouse, a young detective named Riley had watched the whole thing. He wasn't there to save Albert. He was there to document the kill. Albert had tipped him off, knowing that if he died, he wanted the world to see who pulled the trigger. The trigger had been pulled, and history had changed. The syndicate thought they had buried their past, but they had only succeeded in creating a martyr for a new kind of justice. January 1944, New York City, police headquarters. The death of Arthur Miller in Chicago and the disappearance of Albert Weser in New York remained unsolved in the official files, but the underworld knew. The word spread through the social clubs and the tenement halls. The tailor had been clipped, but Albert had the last laugh. 2 weeks after the shooting, a package arrived at the office of Thomas Dewey, who was now the governor of New York. It wasn't the Green Ledger, that was lost in the river, but it was a series of recorded statements Albert had made in Chicago, detailing the inner workings of the commission. These recordings became the blueprint for the next decade of organized crime investigations. They provided the names, the methods, and the hierarchies that would eventually lead to the dismantling of the old guard. Dutch Schultz had died in a hail of bullets, but his betrayer had died with a whisper that echoed louder than any Tommy gun. The mafia began to change. The old flamboyant bosses were replaced by men who stayed in the shadows, men who realized that the greatest threat wasn't a rival gang, but the man sitting across the table with a ledger. The city moved on. The war ended, and the Palace Chop House was eventually torn down. But on cold, rainy nights in Jersey, the old-timers still talk about the night Dutch Schultz was betrayed. Every empire is built on a secret, and every secret has a price. Albert Weser paid his in full, but he made sure the world saw the receipt. Present day, New York City. If you walk down the streets of the Bronx today, you won't find many traces of the Dutch Schultz era. The speakeasies are gone, replaced by modern apartments and coffee shops. But the ghost of the beer baron still lingers in the urban folklore. History remembers the killers, the Lucianos, the Capones, the Schultzes. But it often forgets the men like Albert Weser, the architects of shadows who made the violence possible and then tried to survive its consequences. The story of Albert Weser is a reminder that in the world of crime, there are no clean exits. You can change your name, your face, and your city, but you can never outrun the person you used to be. The betrayal that happened in 1935 took 8 years to finish its work, proving that the mafia's memory is longer than any statute of limitations. Dutch Schultz died in the Palace Chop House, but the legend of his fall was written by the man who wasn't there. It was a story of loyalty, greed, and the ultimate cost of a life lived in the dark. As the Hudson River flows past the piers of Manhattan, it carries with it the secrets of 1,000 men who thought they were smarter than the system. They were just pieces on a board, moved by forces they couldn't control. Nobody knew until it was too late. The mistake wasn't trying to escape. The mistake was thinking the past dies just because you stopped looking at it. If you found this deep dive into the mafia's most complex betrayal fascinating, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more true crime history. These stories are written in blood and hidden in the archives, and we're here to bring them to light. Now I have to ask, if you were in Albert Weser's shoes, would you have sold out the boss to buy yourself 8 years of peace, or would you have stayed loyal to a madman? Let me know in the comments.